Good to go.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I am Elena from Books Inc. Very excited to host Dan Harder, author of Rancho de Amor, in celebration of Bookstore Romance Day, year 2. Very happy to have him in conversation with Steven Winn, who is a award-winning journalist and also a fan of Dan's writing. So they're very good friends. I think we're going to have a great conversation. We will be keeping everyone muted and cameras off for their conversation to avoid background noise. We will welcome questions at the end of their talk. So please, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, put them into the chat, and Hannah will be keeping an eye on those, and we can admit you on camera if you're comfortable. If you would rather have her read the question for you, please let us know that as well. And I will leave it to the two buddies to talk about this book, and I will turn myself off now.
Thank you. But I want to thank you, Elena, and Books Inc. for asking me on. This is really an honor to be with you.
We're very excited, so thank you. I'm gonna mute myself now.
And an honor for me as well. I mean, the great thing, especially on a hot day like this, you see really the advantage of Zoom. None of us had to park and schlep through the heat to get to the bookstore. We're all just comfortably there. So welcome to all of you. And it's a pleasure to talk to Dan about this. I don't know how many of you caught what Dan was speaking about a moment ago about how this novel wasn't meant to be a novel at all in the first place. It started out as a script. I wanted to pick up on that and ask you if by virtue of living in Southern California, are you sort of stipulated that everyone must write a screenplay or a treatment at some point while they're there?
Yeah, if you're not a waiter in Los Angeles at some point with a script in your back pocket, ready to drop on, oh, you're an agent, oh, you're a producer, you're really not living in LA, you're not from LA, and you have to do it. Actually, no, it's a big city and not that many. In fact, that's one of the things I really like about LA. I should not be saying this perhaps up in San Francisco, but it's a huge city with all sorts of things going on. There is a large portion of that city that's really fascinated by the movie industry, the industry as it's called down there. And, a lot of people writing, but not many people making it. And if you write poetry, you're not going to make it. So you do it because you love it. So I'm never disappointed that I haven't made $1 million from my poetry. To write scripts, you have other expectations.
How much, once you got into the room with the studio folks, how much fatuous flattery did you hear?
How much what?
Fatuous flattery did you hear?
Well, not enough.
Well, the real thing that counts is when they write the check, right?
Exactly. We were waiting for that. That would have been flatulence I would have liked.
Well, how long between the time that this now this was the script or the treatment that became Rancho de Amor?
It was the script was Oranges. This was always just a treatment, and that was written probably 23 years ago.
Just so folks understand, explain exactly what a treatment is as opposed to a full script.
Yeah, it's a good question. The treatment is about 17 pages of the plot, the characters, the what is this about, and a little bit of the dialogue, so that a studio, the readers can get a sense of whether or not they'll even ask for a spec script or some script from you. And that's what a treatment is. And so it was the entire thing. Now, this is very different. The novel is very different from that treatment. That treatment might have worked well as a film. I think the book would as well, but I didn't want to do it. I just saw a number of things in that treatment that I just didn't like. And, you write, when you're writing, your characters often take over, and they went in a slightly different direction than what would have been, or where they would have gone had it been a script.
So 23 years is a long time for something to sit dormant. What do you think sort of caused, as you describe it, the knock at the door that, or at the drawer rather, that said, "Let us out. We want to be a novel."
Well, I'm not quite sure. I know that I had been writing some pretty dark pieces. Seeing, you know, I had the Marsh put on a killer story. It wasn't the premiere, but it was essentially, it was an equity production. It was a 6-week run. So I was seeing this dark noir-esque play of mine a lot and dealing with it. And I wanted to write something else. I've written kids books, and I like writing kids books because they're not particularly dark. I mean, there's some really wonderful darkish kids books, but no, mine aren't. So I like to go back and forth. I like romantic comedies. My wife and I watch a good number of them. And so it was just the opportunity to do something very different. I had not written a novel. I'd written some novellas and short stories, but not a full novel. And so I wanted to do that. And these characters, because I think about plots from time to time, I remembered, for whatever reason, at that right time, this plot, more or less, and then those characters. And that's when I guess they were knocking, and I didn't hear it until they made me think about them. And then I opened the drawer and saw that it was fun. It would be fun to try, just an experiment.
Before we go a little further with that, I want to just pick up on something. You said that you and your wife watch a lot of rom-coms. Who are some of your touchstones, or some works that you especially admire, whether in print or on screen?
Well, pretty classic. Anything with Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn, I will watch and watch over and over again. We will. You know, favorite ones: Charade, Discreet, which is with Ingrid Bergman, the Love in the Afternoon, but that's with Cooper. But you know, those are really wonderful. I love Harry Met Sally. I think Nora Ephron is incredibly funny and wise. Recently we saw, let me see, oh yeah, Beyond the Lights wasn't exactly a romantic comedy, but it was quite funny and quite intelligent. In terms of other romances, to be honest, I read very few. I don't know that I've read many more than a few all the way through. I like, it's Jane Austen. Jane Austen got me when I was 17 and a punk kid surfing and sailing and getting into trouble. I fell in love with Jane Austen. Her wit, her wisdom, the depth, how philosophical she is. I used to teach philosophy, and she's one of the best epistemologists I know. That, I think it's chapter 17 of Pride and Prejudice, when Jane and Elizabeth are debating what they know and how they know what they know, a true theory of knowledge. And it's a brilliant chapter. How we know what we know. It happens to be a domestic setting, but those are the settings that most of us live most of our lives in anyway. So I really, really love her work, and have read most of her works.
It's funny you would mention that, because I actually thought of Emma with respect to your heroine with Catherine Doyle, both of them being slightly self-deluding heroines who don't really know their minds or their hearts as clearly as they think they do. Emma especially, but it's true of Catherine Doyle also.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you about, again, a little bit about more of this transformation, that the basic bones of the treatment are those that furnished forth the novel, or were there some, you know, substantial structural and or thematic things that emerged in writing the novel that were not, at least in vestigial form, there in the treatment?
I'd say more thematic issues were not as apparent until my characters started talking about things. Until they started to live and have a vision of things on their own. The plot is pretty much the same. You know, it's the contrast. You know, the sine qua non of theater is conflict, or at least contrast. And there was this immediate contrast, if not conflict, between the rural and the urban, the sophisticated sophisticatedly educated and very bright woman from New York City, and an educated. He had gone to college until his parents died. He had to taking care of his sister, but he was a cowboy. He loved cowboying, and he loved the quiet. And so you got the noise and the bustle, hustle, bustle, and then you got the silence and the isolation. You got two very different worlds, two different worldviews. And there was an article written by Wesley, New York Times. It was a brilliant article, forget his full name, about the elements of a good romantic comedy. And
Wesley Morris.
Yes, Wesley Morris, exactly. And he rang the bell that was ringing for me. It's how the essence of a romantic comedy seems to me and to him to be this coming together of two people who are different. How do we accommodate one another? How can we even love one another and complement one another? How can we learn to be together? What is that chemistry that makes up for more than just being together? That's love and the sexual tension and all of that, which is also exciting. But also, how can two very different people with very different backgrounds come together and make a go of it and learn how to like one another, to learn how other people live? And so that was the setup. I had been briefly a cowboy, and not so briefly lived out in the middle of nowhere. So I knew rural life better than most people that grow up in Los Angeles and live in San Francisco and Paris. But so I knew a fair amount about that. And then of course I lived the urban life. So I thought, wow, interesting contrast.
Without giving anything away, one of the things that's fun about your book, many things are, but one of them is that inside this romantic comedy, there's a romance novelist lurking inside of it, one Loretta Debonair, which as readers will see, has a witty turn to the name itself. I couldn't help thinking she's very old, and I couldn't help thinking of Barbara Cartland. Was she in your head at all as a model for Loretta?
Well, after the fact, she was going to be an older woman. And then I believe somebody at my wonderful publisher, West Margin Press, suggested, have you read any Barbara Cartland?
No.
And I said, no, I have not. And my wife said, oh, well, we have a book or two of hers. Take a look at this. And then I realized, oh, yeah, this is perfect. So she became ex post facto an influence, if that works out.
That's the case, in this case, of post-mortem life imitating art or something.
Exactly.
Something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let me ask you about, it's the second annual romance day here at Books Inc., which of course after two, it's now a firm tradition, which must be repeated invariably for every year henceforth. But one thinks typically of romance novels being female protagonists and often female writers, but by no means always. I'm not familiar with a lot of the authors who turned up in my little search about male romance novelists, but there certainly are some. What tends to be the case, it seems, is that they tend to take male protagonists. Your real protagonist, the real voice of this book is Catherine Doyle. It's really a woman's book. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about crossing the gender line and trying to inhabit the sensibility of a female character.
It's an interesting question, and it's been something in my life for a long time. As an instance of it in my practical writing life, when in my mid-20s I was not publishing a whole lot of my poetry. And I thought, well, I'm going to try a pseudonym, and then I'm going to try to write like her as well, Christine Dutton. And I didn't have any more luck publishing any of Christine Dutton's work than I was having with my own. But what I did discover was that Christine Dutton is a really good poet. And I, in fact, am somewhat jealous of her. She does have a different sensibility. When I think about what a woman might feel, or just feel what a woman might feel, I don't know that I get it right, but I know that I am somewhat different from the Dan Harder who writes other poetry, and it's exciting. And I think, quite frankly, I know we're all supposed to be writing about ourselves, but I think because we only really know ourselves, but I'm not sure we know ourselves all that well anyway. And I think it is something that all people who write do, whether they feel they should or not. It's to inhabit their characters. They have to care about somebody else. Otherwise, every character is the same character. You're just popping out, well, there I am, Dan, 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 and Dan is talking to Dan. Dan gets bored with Dan, but Catherine didn't bore Dan. And who is this other person? How do we reach across gender lines, all sorts of lines, to write about the other? Who is that other in relationship to ourselves? Who is that other in relationship to his or her own life and context? And it is, I think, an extremely exciting aspect of writing, how exploring the world. And Catherine became, I honestly don't know whether she was, when we were writing The Treatment, she was going to be the protagonist, the driving force. I don't know. In fact, trying to recall right now, I think that Sam was probably going to be, but she took over almost immediately.
As you say, characters have wills of their own sometimes.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, small soapbox here, just listening to you talk about this, it raises the whole question that's so much in the air now about appropriation. If we can write about characters who are, forget crossing gender lines, but, can a white male writer write about a black female character, or a black character of any, without being guilty of or presuming something culturally about the experience? And it just seems to me, if we start building boundaries like that between what people can and cannot write, we're in danger of stifling the imagination, what makes art what it is, which is to imagine ourselves, both as writers and as readers, into someone else's experience.
Absolutely. I mean, what is literature? We teach literature to students. We want them to read broadly. How can what are the students supposed to get from that literature, if not an understanding of other people? So even just the act of reading is an act of going across lines and listening to, getting to know, getting to explore, getting to care about other people. And so, we're crossing lines reading. You're going to have to, and if we're going to do that, the writers have got to cross those lines. Interestingly enough, I have a commission from the Oakland Symphony to write an opera or an oratorio, dramatic oratorio, about Paul Robeson. Speaking of, again, crossing lines, but if we don't cross lines, then we cannot communicate. If we think that there's some barrier between us that is uncrossable, then can we ever truly sympathize, or even more empathize with other people? And if we can't do that, then I think we're lost as a herd.
I will guarantee you that someone will raise objections to a white author writing that oratorio libretto. That's just where we are now. Someone will quarrel with it before they've read or heard a word of it.
Yes.
Anyway, it's just an interesting topic in itself. Well, listen, let's get a little flavor of this. Why don't you read us a little bit from Rancho de Amor? Tell us what your context is, where we are in the book, and give people a little feel for the writing.
Okay. Well, this is, let's see, page 18 or so. So it's pretty early in the novel, and Catherine has been asked by a publishing company, a very good publishing company, say, I don't know, not Penguin, that's too big, but I don't know, any number of smaller but well-known, who was it? New Directions, for example. New Directions would be a good one. a publisher, and it's going out of business. It's close to going out of business. Like, oh my word, they're not selling enough books. And so this wonderful editor, the best editor they've got, is asked to go out and find this romance writer who has written this one book. It's won a prize, and it's the #1 bestseller in America, making tons of money, and no one knows where she is or who she is exactly. There's a great mystery about that. Well, this company is desperate for a hit, so she sent out there to find anything she's written. If she's got some old shopping lists, well, we'll publish those. I mean, she's so famous right now. We'll do that. Just find her. And so she goes out to California, or is sent out to California, to find a romance writer. And this is where she's packing to go. Catherine is in New York City, in Manhattan. She started to pack, but realized quickly that she really had no idea how she should dress for this odd adventure. The only thing she knew for sure was that she was going west, way west, into sartorial circumstances she was not prepared for. What did one wear in weather, potentially ranging from blizzard to heat wave, when meeting an aging female romance writer who just happened to be a cattle rancher? Oh yeah, that's another little detail of Ms. Debonair. This whole crazy escapade was twisting her well out of both her comfort zone and her closet. As she held up a series of disappointing choices before a mirror in her bedroom, she realized that the challenge was less that she didn't have anything to fit the occasion, but that she didn't fit the occasion. Catherine was a 28-year-old woman with long dark hair, large brown eyes, full lips, a pretty face, and a shapely figure, although at that moment of self-conscious cataloging, she wasn't so sure about any of it. Her bones seemed a little too large, her hair seemed a little too wild, her skin seemed a little too pale, her eyes a little too round, her cheeks a little too wide. After confronting these exaggerated defeats in the mirror, she moved on to other, more obvious reasons she was the wrong woman for this job. For one, she didn't like romance novels, Western or otherwise, and with the exception of books by Austen and the Bronte sisters, she never read them. To her, they offered little more than a collection of unrealistic characters pirouetting through unrealistic plots towards unavoidably happy endings. And yet she was now expected to flatter a writer of this sort of romantic froth and get her to sign a book contract with a publishing company known for its discriminating taste. And then there was California. The most memorable part of her one and only trip to the Golden State was the sunburn she cooked into her skin while sitting at an outside cafe with fellow book editors in January. And she wasn't going to California. She wasn't just going to California. She was expected to find someone somewhere in cowboy country. Had she been a 6-year-old boy, this might have been a dream adventure. But Catherine found nothing particularly interesting, attractive, or compelling about either cows or the men and women who pushed them around. The most annoying thought, however, was that this really wasn't her job. She wasn't an acquisition editor. She was a copy editor who much preferred working with contract-settled manuscripts than searching for that tiny, shiny needle in the immense haystack of mediocre prose. In short, she had the mission she'd been given had the mission she'd been given not been so vitally important to her job, to the job of her many and much loved co-workers, and to the very survival of Banter House Books, she wouldn't have agreed to her boss's request to fly out to California and look for a reclusive romance writer in some isolated cow pasture. But she had said yes, and now she could do nothing but pack a few marginally acceptable pieces of clothing, her toiletries, a small container of Dramamine, 2 phone chargers, she invariably lost at least one wherever she went, and 4 books, the biggest and pinkest being a copy of Rancho de Amor. She would do what she told Vito she would do. And anyway, she briefly reflected, whatever it was going to be different, which meant she would push Ralph and her own romantic disappointments out of her mind for a few days. With that thought in mind and her bag ready to grab before the crack of dawn the next morning, she rushed out to join a handful of friends at their monthly book group.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that it's a great passage that you read because it really captures a lot of what's strong and funny about this book. First of all, you have a romance novelist in hiding in the book, and then you have a heroine who doesn't like romance novels, which is a funny setup to begin with. But also, you're seeing sort of two tropes being knitted together here. One is she's going to be the fish out of water, but she's a fish out of water who's on a scavenger hunt, who has to solve a mystery. So it's very cleverly set up, and we really see it right there in that passage. So if that doesn't tempt people into this book, nothing will. I mean, it really is a great setup. Let me ask you about the setting that you evoke so vividly, and that's this mid-coast, Central Coast, California, beautiful ranch area, and also wine growing region that it's undergoing these kind of demographic and changes at the same time. You spent some time in this region when you were some years ago, longer ago than when you wrote the treatment that became this book.
Yes.
Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, I was 19. I was going to UCLA. I didn't know really what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do the arts. I knew that they weren't particularly practical, but that's what I wanted. I started as a pre-med student, but I quickly realized I was going to have to actually study, and that I didn't want to have to do. And I went into pre-law, and that was really fascinating, and I loved it, con law particularly, constitutional law. But I also then got into the film school there because I'd made and sold a little film in high school, and they let me in. And I didn't like it. I really didn't like it. I just wanted to write scripts and not I guess, make real films. So, although this was just before that, it was when I was 19, summer, what kind of job am I going to have? I needed a job. I had to pay for my living. Probably a construction job, as I'd done some of, but an uncle of mine at the Easter table, at my aunt and uncle's table, suggested, and he loved poking people, and he also was connected to the Bixby ranches. He was actually the head of, well, I guess not the financial operations, but, well, maybe it was. He was fairly high up in their financial dealings, both with their oil wells down in Long Beach and elsewhere. And he sat at the table, both to find a worker for the ranch that he liked and had visited a number of times, and also to see what my family's reaction would be. Asked me if I wanted to get a job. You know, what was I planning to do for the summer? Sell T-shirts at the mall or something? Said, no, I don't know yet, something. He said, you want to be a cowboy? And I said, yeah. And I knew he had connections to the Bixby ranches. And, you know, my mother was suitably concerned, and that added some cachet to my interest. And in fact, everybody does. But you don't know how to ride a horse. You shouldn't be doing that. I said, oh, I want this job. Oh yes, I want this job. And he got me that job. And it was a summer job. We were just to be basically rebuilding fences and things like that. And I went there with my childhood friend, Eric James, and he and I got there and pretty soon realized that they were going to have us do pretty much anything that a ranch hand would be doing, i.e., although you're really not supposed to call them cowboys unless they're really dealing mostly with horses and dealing with cattle and horses, and not building fences and building barns. But nonetheless, we're supposed to be cowboys or ranch hands. My friend he left. He had other things. He had a girlfriend, and there were other things that were more tempting than the really rough work that was out there. And I wanted to quit with him, but I decided, well, I'll stay on. And it was an absolute life-changing experience, because I was with people who were very different from me. Politically, it was very, very different, particularly with the foreman, who my friend and I could keep from going to work by winding him up at 6:30 in the morning, talking about, I don't know, those damn hippies, those damn communists, those damn this, that, and the other things. And if we kept him going, we could end up at lunch and he's still talking about those things. Yeah, out where we're supposed to be building a fence, but he'd still be haranguing the rest of the world.
This was the late 60s or so? This is when this was?
This was 70s, the relatively early 70s, 71, 72. And so then I stayed on and worked and had to work roundups and rope horses that needed to be inoculated, and then dig your heels in and be dragged around or skidded around the corral to calm them down enough so you could then stick a syringe in their neck and to vaccinate them from what was I think the Mexican flu, an influenza that was killing a lot of horses, and we had some wild horses that we needed to inoculate, and just everything. Just had to do everything. And I realized at that point that because I was not sure what I really wanted to do, other than maybe do something artistic, and I was unsettled in my life for various reasons, home and otherwise, I discovered that I could do something that I'd never thought I'd be able to do with people that I never thought that I could work with people that I never thought that I could work comfortably with. And I liked them, I respected them, they respected me, and it changed my thinking about what I'd be capable of doing for the rest of my life, wherever I was. I could always walk off and help build a fence if I needed to, even at 68 as I am now. So it was independence. It was a learning experience out there. And I learned the work, not well. I cannot say, please folks, I'm not a cowboy. I did some cowboying for a few months one summer. But I became friends with the foreman out there, not the old foreman, but a guy who was working on a parallel ranch. There are two ranches, the Coho Ranch and the Halama Ranch. And if nobody's gone out to Halama Beach, you can go out to Halama Beach and camp there. It's just west of Santa Barbara. Incredible place. And you get to see Point Conception. That's as close as you'll get for now, to an Vandenberg Air Force Base. In any event, he and I kept bumping into each other. I went out there with my wife before she was my wife and proposed. We'd already talked about marriage, but it was not formally done. And at Point Conception, I proposed to her because it seemed like a well-conceived idea. And so we were out. It was an important place. I needed to show her where I'd become, to a certain extent, who I was. And he busted us because we weren't supposed to. He didn't know who we were at first, and then I told him that, oh yeah, I remember you. And we've stayed in contact. And he actually checked my cowboying passages. And I said I didn't get anything. We got a couple of things a little wrong, but he's still in contact with me. So it was an interesting experience.
Yeah, great story. We're going to go to questions in a little bit here, but I wanted a couple of things. I want to follow up on that a little bit. Did you, while you were writing the book, go back to the area to refresh your memory, or is it something that you wanted to sort of summon from memory and not have it sort of in cognitive dissonance with whatever that area looks like now, or how did you contemporize?
Well, I've written a fair number of journalistic pieces. They tend to be the literary nonfiction. I did a number of features for the LA Times, but they weren't investigative journalism. And I've written a couple of academic articles. I like to get it right. If I'm going to say this is what is, I mean, I'll come up with the weird plots and the weird characters, but I don't want to get the details wrong of other people's lives if I can avoid it. So, and because I'd been asked by the Times to write some pieces about Southern California, and this was a part that I knew a lot about, I ended up writing 2 or 3 articles about that area, learning about solitude and whatnot. And each time I would go back, because I had developed this relationship with the guy who became the foreman of the Coho Halama ranches. And so I was able to go out there, visit it from time to time, and to bring my sons out there, bring friends out there every once in a while. So yeah, I did go back out there to get things right. I read a lot of books about, in fact, all these books are Californiana, and so much of it is about grasses. What kinds of grasses grew here before the Spanish came and before the Yankees came and before our agriculture changed. Just weird things about that area. It's a fascinating area.
One last question about your presence in this book. There is a character in there who writes poetry, which is similar in form to the kind of poetry that you have written. You call them zipper poems. I wanted to ask you to just explain that a little bit, and also say one of the things that's admirable is that you put a signature of yourself on a character who himself is not the most likable character in the book, which I think is quite admirable of you too.
That's why I'm smiling and kind of laughing. Yes, I can be a pretentious jerk. Yeah, and
but you're willing to take yourself down a peg also.
Yes. Well, yeah. And, writing poetry, right? Creating a form of poetry. Well, that's all well and good, but it doesn't make you God. And it just allowed me to play with that. And there are a number of self-referential pieces in there. But it's a form of poetry that lends itself to a character who might be a little pretentious and a little pompous.
Anyway,
and so
for the readers who know you personally, it's a funny little signature on the book, and it's fun to come upon that.
Yeah, you know those zippers.
I do indeed. So I think we're going to summon our Books Inc. friends back here and see if we're ready to start managing the questions.
Yes, hi everyone. Just give me a minute to get situated. We do have a few questions in the pipeline. The first one is from Susan. She wants to know how you learn the secrets of the publishing industry, and she says the industry drama that the book reveals is fascinating.
Well, thank you, Susan. I married someone who knows a lot about it. Aura, my wife, we knew each other in high school, at Hamilton High School, but she stayed in LA. I left, dropped out of UCLA eventually and went elsewhere. But she worked at Brentano's Books in Beverly Hills. And when we got together, I don't know, 8-9 years after graduating high school, we kept bumping into each other. And finally we realized, oh yeah, this is it. Oh, this is absolutely it. She came up to San Francisco and worked in bookstores there as a clerk, and sometimes as a buyer, so knew that part of it. And then we moved up to Oregon. We had a restaurant for a while, sold it, did well, relatively modestly, let's say, and moved up to Oregon. And I was the CFO, and I made a few mistakes. There were enough zeros attached to that number that we made, and we had to get jobs. So she got a job at a publisher in Portland, and a Graphic Arts Center Publishing, and worked there. And they were really nice to her, and they needed a sales rep down in California, and they said, do you want to move back? And we wanted to move back to San Francisco. So we did, and they set her up there. So for years, she was able to work mostly from home. We got to know the whole of the West Coast, because she'd actually go on these bookstore visiting jobs, and I would bring the kids, and I'd go to the parks with them, and she'd go to the bookstore with them with her books and do her work. So she was a rep. She did some acquisition work there, a little bit of editing, and certainly had done book buying for bookstores. So she knows an awful lot about it. So I lived with someone who was well informed.
Very nice. Thank you, Susan. So this next question, I'm going to actually bring Joseph and Mimi on to the screen. So give me a minute, Joseph. I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask you to unmute your video. So you'll have to click a couple things to come on. So make sure you're ready.
Hi, Hi, sweeties. How are you?
Hi. Good. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too.
So you were talking about your former foreman and his rather conservative political views.
Hmm.
And I wanted to ask what forces you think shaped those views back then, and what you think the situation is now.
Well, that's an interesting question. Thanks, Mimi. My son and wonderful friend, girlfriend, Mimi. They he was a really interesting guy. He was very part Indian, Cherokee, I believe, and darker than most of the men out there. Certainly darker than I am. But he'd grown up on and around cattle ranches, in and around. I think he'd been in Texas for a while, and I know he was outside of Lompoc. But he got used to that kind of rough and ready, rural, take care of yourself, government, who needs it? We can take care of ourselves. And there is something, to be honest, I am quite progressive and left, but I do get that there is something to taking care of yourself, that personal responsibility, that reliance on the neighbor and their reliance on you, and that kind of tough, dangerous, often dangerous physical work, and the concentration on and focus on that environment and the people therein, and not thinking about beyond that. He bought into it. He bought into it in a fairly large way. Now, I must say, he was bright enough, but he was not the most curious man, let us say. Different from the other foreman, the fellow who was a cowboy when I was a cowboy, and then he moved on to being a foreman. He had been a cop for a little while. He had gone to college for a little while. He read an awful lot, and he thought an awful lot about how to best husband the cattle, how to be a husbandman of the land, a caretaker of the land. And so his view of the world was somewhat different. Rural, certainly, the same sort of independence, yes, but he knew that there was a larger world to which he was connected and to which the ranches were connected as well. So, and he was more of a model for my character. And I think now that part of that question, there is the myths about the cowboy's life. The real cowboy life is not all that exciting. It's an awful lot of building barns and painting fences and rebuilding fences and you got to weaning cattle, cutting cattle, yeah, the roundups, but it's an awful lot of sitting around as well. Even in a roundup, it's not all that exciting all the time. So it's got this mystique of being constantly dangerous and wild, and cowboys are just insane. If you're insane, you're not a good cowboy. If you're not the best cowboy on that ranch, the best cowboy was one who didn't use his reins. He used his legs to move his cutting horse. He was the most gentle man, and he loved puns. He loved punning, so he loved words. But he loved being alone. And so he got the loneliness, he got the isolation, he got the beauty of solitude, but he was hardly this wild thing that is now being used by one side or the other. By many of us on the left, oh, they're crazy, they're damn cowboys. Well, that's not quite true. And then on the other side, they're the real men, and they're the real this and this, there's this, who cares about the cities and all the rest of these people. We can take care of ourselves, which is absolutely absurd, because without the markets to sell the cattle to, there is no cattle ranching. So, we're all interconnected, and some get it and some don't. And I think now we are suffering under a desire for people to be recognized for who they are, their value in a rural setting, their value as manual laborers or people on the outside. But it's a little absurd, and yeah, it's a big world out there, and it's all interconnected.
And to a certain extent, Sam, since you brought him up, the you know, the other romantic lead of the book and an interesting character, to a certain extent, he has to keep some of his intellectual interests, some of his artistic, sort of under his hat in order to get along with the world that he lives in. And in effect, he has his feet in two worlds, but one of them he has to keep somewhat, not hidden exactly, but somewhat out of view to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, there's a conservative mentality that is prevalent in the country, and if you have other ideas, you don't want to advertise it too darn much with certain people. But we also have a place in the mountains and Sierras, and that's true of many people up there. But it's very untrue of many people up there as well. And it's surprising. You know, we lived in rural Oregon where the bookstore owner was a communist, and it's just okay. And he made no bones about it. And people, some people probably hated him, but he was like the Pied Piper. The kids in that town just listened to and would have followed him into the ocean if he'd piped them that way. So,
one of the things I think you get so right about small towns is that people not only know each other's business, but they often think they know it when they're wrong about it, which is, I think, a really keen insight into small towns. People think they're all over each other's business when in fact they're not.
Exactly. I've written a few poems about that. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you, Joseph and Mimi. I'm going to take you off.
Bye, guys.
So long.
All right. Thank you. I think you're all done. So we do have another question here from Eric. And he wants to know what percentage approximately of your writing is completely invented versus the things that are based, at least partially, on your own experiences.
Wow. Well, it really depends on what I'm writing. So that percentage really varies. I have written a thus far not yet good enough for viewing science fiction novel. And the main character does things that he's a photojournalist. I've never been a photojournalist. And he's out in the middle of, wherever. It has to do to a certain extent with some surfing issues, but very few. Epidemiology, a lot more, and I'm not an epidemiologist. So science fiction, that's really 80, 90% fiction. But the fiction comes obviously from things I've read, things I've experienced. Everything's grist for the mill. And so it's impossible to say that anything is purely Dan Harder. Or purely imagined by Dan Harder. All I am is mixing, the big mixing bowl. This one's called a novel, this one's called a poem, whatever it is. And I'm mixing up things that I've heard from others, learned from others, and whatnot. So I'd say about half and half. I mean, I've written an awful lot about myself for the LA Times, and in certain poems, but an awful lot of things having nothing to do with my imagination or, self. So maybe 60-40 self fiction. All
right, so next, let's see. I'm waiting on a couple people to get back to me about whether they want to be on screen, but it looks like Jeff is willing to be on screen to ask his question. So let me find you, Jeff, and ask you to come on board. Let's see, here he is. All right, Jeff, are you with us?
Yes.
All right.
I don't see him yet.
There he is.
There.
There he
Hey,
is.
Jeff.
Hello, Jeff.
Good to see you.
Great to be here, and I want to ask you a rather straightforward question. Might you write a sequel, if not of this work, of another work that you've written?
Is romantic?
Yes.
Yeah. I've been toying with that. I'm finishing up a young adult novel, and I am going to be dealing with another novel. It's very strange and not a happy piece at all. But I am tempted. I set it up kind of to have the two protagonists, the couple, doing some kind of a mystery solving. Again, the city mouse, what she knows, country mouse, what he knows, and they can't solve it alone. The key is the two of them together, and I think that would be fun, and it would be romantic, and I think I think that one of the things about one of the unfortunate things about romances is that you're looking at the courtship, and some get to the bodice ripping and all the rest. This does not. Sorry, folks. Occasion, but doesn't. But I think that to sustain a relationship is extremely romantic, and so might be an interesting thing to explore, a maturing romance and how that works out and how they can solve some mysteries. And there are a lot, I would say, particularly out at the coast, land use issues and all sorts of stuff. But certainly there's plenty of stuff, as you know, living in New York possible. So.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to unmute you, so wave, or I'm going to mute you and stop the video. Okay, and then so I have a question from Juta. Let's see, she's asking about, oh, hold on one second. Okay, I think we're all good with Jeff. She wants to know if you consider yourself a romantic, since you wrote about kind of a romantic figure of a cowboy.
I should probably ask my wife that, but what does she have to say? Nothing.
I was gonna say, is she following along? Should I bring her on?
That's a telling.
Yes.
No, and not saying anything is a telling answer, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, I am. I didn't hear it. I now hear her. She says yes. Extraordinarily. Oh, that's the answer.
She's saving your bacon, Dan. She's saving your bacon.
Right. Yes, I am.
Very nice.
And I like it.
If I have any more questions, someone says you look oddly familiar and brought up something about public access TV. I don't know if that's an inside joke or not, but have you been on screen before? This is from a person named Dean.
Oh, no, I think it's Blake. Oh no,
Okay.
it could be Saluhuru. Could possibly be. Yeah, I was Mr. Bobby for a while on public access TV. I was the sidekick of Saluhuru, a good friend of mine who lives in Norway, an actor, very good actor, director, writer, and he got this show together, this public access show together, this kind of variety show with the comedy, his comedy, my comedy, and we had this comedy show for 3 years, and I think more than 7 people did watch it. But it's now online. You can see little excerpts.
Oh, nice.
You've got the stomach for it. Thanks, Dean. Saul.
All right, let me see.
Where do people find that? What's the link?
It's the Art Shack. It's just called Art Shack. And it was on, the public access station in San Francisco, what it was, Channel 28 or whatever, for 3 years. We would do one every couple of weeks or maybe once a month. And it's now excerpted. I think all of them are on at the Art Shack. And some of them are actually still funny. But.
Good. All right, I think I have one last question that I believe was not asked yet, maybe partially, but they're just wondering if, this is actually from our friend Elena, if any of the juicy parts are based on real life situations in your book.
Particularly the juicy parts. Well, yeah, I never was, I have actually fought a much smaller brush fire, but I have experienced brush fires. I've experienced kind of, some odd kind of, oh my word, here we are. Yeah, I know whereof I speak or write, but that was, again, my characters kind of determined that, which was really nice, and I liked where they were going. And I think one of the great things about romance, Yuta, and I guess that makes me an extraordinary, or at least a committed romance devotee, is the imagination. What will the imagination do, and where can you go with that about romance? Although I will say, I think one of the biggest problems in romances, for romances, and love itself, are expectations. And so I think we tend to believe our hopes and dreams more than we should. To, again, pull two people together who are different, you gotta let your expectations go and just dance with circumstance. Anyway.
Well, nice. Well, that was my last question. So I'm going to bring Elena on to see, unless anyone wants to send a last minute appropriate question, or if Steven has anything to ask. Elena, I'm bringing you up.
I was just going to follow up on Elena's remarks, saying, I think that the fire she was referring to wasn't just brush fires. You dodged that very successfully.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was talking about the publishing industry.
Oh, it broke up her question.
It was a duller
Anna was skimming stuff. So.
I was skimming, but someone had also asked about publishing, so I thought I'd skip hers and throw her. Well, who knows? Maybe
either way, it was a delightful way that the question turned out. So I'm not gonna.
Sorry.
I guess if you work in a bookstore, so, anything about publishing is considered the juicy part.
Exactly.
It's a weird world. We hear some things I would never have expected.
Well, an interesting little tale, speaking of romance and bookstores, Ora and I had known each other in high school. I ran into her at a bookstore, in that bookstore, Brentano's in Beverly Hills. I was living in Paris. We had the most extraordinary conversation. It lasted 15, 20 minutes. It was like, oh my God, who is this woman? And then I went back to France, and we were never going to see each other again. And both of us had been knocked out, but we ran into each other in San Francisco a year or so later.
That's amazing.
So yeah, I get it.
Well, I met my boyfriend at Books Inc. So
Oh, really?
almost 10 years we've been together.
Excellent.
Like
They
that
bring
was
people together.
Ethan Hawke movie trilogy, Before Midnight, or whatever those three films were called, that they were going to meet again in a year, and then they didn't.
Was that
yeah,
yesterday?
Before sunrise, before sunset.
Exactly.
Those ones.
Yeah.
Linklater, the writer.
Oh, okay. Well, I think you guys had a great conversation. I will say I wrote down my favorite quote that Dan said, which is, if you're insane, you're not a good cowboy. So please, everyone, keep that in mind. If you're considering being a ranch hand and working your way up, don't be insane. You're not going to make it very far.
Or your horse will throw you a long ways. Yeah.
Yeah, you might die, so don't do that.
Well, I want to thank Dan for a great conversation, and for you, both of you, and all of you out there in Zoom land who stayed tuned in.
Yes,
thank
you
all.
both for joining us.
Thank you, Steven. Great chat.
Pleasure.
That was great. And don't forget, if you have not yet purchased your book, you can just go to booksinc.net and order it. We'll ship it out to you tomorrow. So just.
I see who you are.
Dan will shame you if you don't. So don't forget. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and celebrating Bookstore Romance Day and supporting an independent bookstore. We're very excited that we could have both Steven and Dan to be a part of this, and hopefully we see you again. Keep an eye on our calendar and have a great evening.
Thanks.
Cool. Bye,
Bye, everybody.
everyone.